Decluttering and organization seems to be on everyone's mind this year, so today I'll show you how I made this modern 3-tier paper tray that even Marie Kondo would be proud of. Let's get started. I started the project out by finding some long skinny walnut offcuts from previous projects, and after picking out the ones that will allow me to yield the least amount of waste, I cut them down to the rough lengths on my table saw. Next, I took all the pieces over to the jointer to flatten and square up one of the faces and edges, before bringing them down to the final thickness on the planer. And lastly, I ripped all the boards down to a uniform width on the table saw. Each of the individual pieces received a dado in them for holding the tray bottom later. Here you see me laying out the individual pieces and then marking out the miter cuts on each. While working with so many similar sized pieces, this simple step will help to avoid accidentally cutting a miter in the wrong direction. With the blade tilted at 45 degrees and all the cuts laid out, I made quick work of the miter cuts by cutting one side, then flipping them over and cutting the other side. For small projects like this, I just use the tape method for gluing up the miter joints. It's quick and provides plenty of clamping pressure for a good glue joint. Since I'm not gluing in the fourth side yet, I used a long piece of tape to pull the two sides together in order to keep the pieces square during the glue up. With the 3 sides of the tray glued up, I could take measurements and cut the pieces that will make up the bottom of the paper tray. With the tray bottom in place, I glued in the fourth side, once again using tape to hold the joints together. After the glue has had time to dry, I started laying out and cutting the bevels along the top edges of the trays. To add a little bit more character, I flipped the trays over to cut a smaller bevel along the bottom edges. While I'm sanding and applying finish to the trays, I'd like to say a quick thank you for checking out this video. And if you haven't yet, I'd love it if you hit that subscribe button to keep up with all my future projects. It really goes a long way in helping me to further grow this channel. Next, I moved on to making the structure that will hold the trays. For these, I picked out a couple of offcuts from the numerous Harry Potter shelves I made in the past few months and milled the pieces to their rough dimensions as I did before. Since both of these boards have some large imperfections in them, I decided to use colored epoxy to stabilize them while adding some color contrast to the piece. To prep for the epoxy, I first used a chisel to clean up any loose material from the wood. Then I cut up some MDF panels to make the form, which are covered up with some sheathing tape to keep the epoxy from sticking to the form while it cured. Here I'm using some 5:1 epoxy mixed with some green pigments. The epoxy I'm using has an amber hue to it, which I really like because it gives a warmer and richer tone to the green pigments that I couldn't get with a clear epoxy. I'll have links to all the materials I used in this build in the descriptions below. Once the epoxy is cured, I removed the boards from the form and ran them through the planer to clean up any overflow. Next, I put the paper trays next to the side panels to see how much the whole unit should lean back. And using a bevel gauge, I was able to transfer this angle to my table saw and miter gauge to make the cut on the housing sides. Here I marked the locations for where I'll cut the 90-degree grooves that will allow the trays to slide back and forth in the housing. Next, I cut a 1/2-inch stop dado into each of the side pieces for receiving the bottom panel later. Since the bit didn't go all the way through to the end of the material, I had to use a chisel to square up the ends of the dado. With the 1/2-inch bit still set up in the router table, I cut a rabbet along the back edge of each side piece that will eventually accept the back panel. Before setting the side pieces aside, I cut some bevels along the front and top edges at the table saw. Here I cut a couple of 1/2-inch ply roughly the size that will eventually make for the bottom and back panels. Then I cut and glued on some thin walnut hardwood strips to cover up the visible plywood edges. After the glue was dry, I trimmed everything flush. At the router table, I cut a rabbet on the back edge of the bottom panel that the back piece will eventually sit in. With the bottom panel complete, I glued it to the two side pieces, using some angle clamps to keep things square. After the parts had some time to dry, I began to fit the back piece, and once that was cut to size, I just glued it in, and that was that. I gotta say, I really enjoy making these small projects using whatever scrap pieces I have left over from the larger builds. Not only does it help me clear out my shop a little, it also allows me to make something very functional. Alright guys, thanks for watching this video, and if you liked it, please don't forget to give it a thumbs up, and maybe you'll like one of my other videos too. See you next time.